Five Nights at Freddy's Fazbear Frights, Volume 3, Story 3. The New Kid, written by Scott Cawthon, Elley Cooper, and Andrea Waggener. Published by Scholastic Entertainment. Narrated by Barone. It's a bright, sunny day. The kind of day that makes you feel like you have to do something. You have to do something fun, or you have to be productive. Devin used his left index and middle fingers to make air quotes, trusting no one would notice his chewed-on cuticles and bitten-down nails. Then he continued in what he hoped was an ominous tone. It's the kind of day when your mom makes you mow the lawn, but today isn't a mowing day. Today is a birthday party day. Devin heard rustling in the classroom. Someone snickered, but he didn't look up from his papers. He kept his head bent, his long hair hanging like a protective shield between him and the class. Normally, he hated having to stand in front of the class, for any reason, but today he was on a mission. If he had to read a stupid assignment for English class, he was going to make it work for him. Devin continued with his story, describing the birthday party scene for a pack of screaming 4-year-olds. He read about the balloons and clowns and the bright-colored bounce house set up in the middle of the green lawn. But this isn't any ordinary bounce house, Devin read. No one knows that yet, but they're going to find out. Now. Devin paused for effect. He didn't hear anything. For all he knew, his teacher, Mrs. Patterson, and his classmates had disappeared, but he wasn't going to look up to see. Devin went on. Because now, little Haley is crawling into the bounce house. She's the first one in. Her twin sister Hope is right behind her. Was that a gasp Devin heard from the third row of desks? He thought it was. Good. He had their attention. He grinned as he kept reading. Hallie makes it almost all the way into the bounce house, her bright pink dress clashing with the house's puffy red vinyl floor. Faster, Hope urges Hallie, pushing Hallie's butt. Hallie still crawls slowly, until suddenly, she's sucked inside the bounce house. Hope giggles and follows her. Devin stopped reading again. He was getting to the good part. But in a second, Hope is going to wish she didn't follow her sister. In just a second, she's looking down as she crawls inside. But now, she's in. She looks up and she sees her sister's partially eaten body lying still on the red vinyl. No, wait. The vinyl isn't red. It's covered in blood. Was that a squeal Devin just heard? He kept reading. And the house isn't a house. It's a big mouth, and the mouth is chewing. And now it's opening wider, and Hope, now screaming, is sliding into... That's enough, Mrs. Patterson shouted. Devin blinked. He still didn't look up. He wasn't finished. Devin Blaine Marks, Mrs. Patterson spurted every one of Devin's 3 names like each was a spitball. Before he could respond, Mrs. Patterson's large, square hand appeared in front of Devin's downward-aimed gaze and snatched the story from his grasp. The pages rattled, and he felt the sting of a paper cut on the web of skin between his thumb and index finger. The classroom was so silent, Devin could hear a bird chirping outside the window. He finally looked up at Mrs. Patterson. What? What? Mrs. Patterson shook her head, sending her blonde ponytail into a wild dance. Mrs. Patterson was an English teacher, but she was also the girls' basketball coach. She was a huge woman. Tall and broad in the shoulders, she towered over Devin, and Devin was already 5'9", tall for his age. If only he were coordinated enough to be a basketball player. Maybe then he'd be a part of Devin. Mrs. Patterson softened her deep voice, and Devin finally raised his gaze to look at her wide face. He even managed to meet her intense blue eyes. Mrs. Patterson's eyes were scary. Everyone in the class thought so. She could reduce you to a pile of smoke and ashes with just a look. Devin was happy he was still standing. Report to Mr. Wright's office, Mrs. Patterson ordered. Devin looked at his story crumpled in Mrs. Patterson's hand. He wanted to argue, but he shrugged and headed toward the classroom door. Heather sat in the second seat from the door in the 3rd row. As he passed that row, he met her gaze. Had it worked? Heather was looking right at him. Yes! Heather Anders, one of the most popular girls in his class and by far the prettiest, had never, not one single time, ever looked at Devin. As far as Heather, and pretty much all the other 9th grade class, was concerned, Devin didn't exist. Or, if she had noticed he existed, he was nothing more than part of the scenery, like a blackboard or a chair. If it wasn't for Devin's best and only friend Mick, and his well-meaning but very annoying mom, Devin would wonder if he did, in fact, exist. Sometimes he wasn't so sure. But today, he existed, and Heather saw him. Triumphant, he grinned at her and gave her a thumbs up as he sauntered toward the classroom door. Heather rolled her eyes and said, "Geez, Devin, that was sick." Devin grinned wider and stood tall as he nodded at her and then strode out of the classroom like he was heading to an important meeting instead of to the principal's office. He'd done it. Even though Heather never noticed Devin, he'd made a careful study of Heather. He watched her, he listened to her, he wanted to know everything about her. The previous week, while Mick was going on about his latest superhero obsession, Devin was listening to Heather talk to her girlfriends. She was complaining about her 4-year-old twin sisters, Hallie and Hope. "They drive me crazy," she told Valerie, her best friend. "I mean, seriously bonkers. I'm always having to babysit them, and I hate it. They're always getting into trouble, breaking something or whatever, and then I get in trouble. I hate them." That same day, Mrs. Patterson handed out the assignment to write an original short story. That's when Devin saw his chance. He saw it, he took it, and he'd made the most of it. Who cared if it cost him a trip to the principal's office? The best creative artists had hidden depths lurking beneath the surface, and usually those depths were misunderstood. Devin and Mick met up after school at their regular spot in the back, at the edge of the teacher's parking lot. Devin couldn't wait to talk to Mick about what had happened with Heather. He hadn't thought to look at Mick before he left English class. He wasn't sure his friend saw what had happened. Mick tended to daydream. He was often caught staring out in the school windows at who knows what. When Devin reached Mick, Mick was juggling his bright purple backpack, a papier-mâché tiger, a plastic Go cup with a curlicue straw, a stack of books that obviously wouldn't fit in the overstuffed backpack, and a half-eaten package of chocolate cupcakes. White frosting from the missing cupcake was stuck to his lower lip. David pointed at the frosting. "Huh? What? Oh." Mick wiped at his mouth with the back of his hand holding up the tiger. It made him look like he was being mauled. It also made him drop the stack of books, which smacked the ground and scattered. Devin shook his head and bent over to pick them up. He stuck them in his own navy blue backpack, which was nearly empty. He'd already done his homework for the day while he was hanging out in Mr. Wright's office. And, unlike Mick, Devin never read a book he wasn't required to read. "Sorry, oh, you got those?" Mick asked. "Thanks." Mick squinted at Devin through his round, wire-rimmed glasses. He shoved his reddish-blonde bangs off of his freckled forehead. They ended up sticking straight up. "Where's your art project?" "I dumped it in the trash." "Why? That four-headed octopus was gnarly." Devin shrugged. He didn't tell Mick that he thought making papier-mâché animals was for kids, and that the art teacher, Mr. Stewart, had given Devin a D on the project, and a lecture on following instructions instead of doing whatever he wanted. "These are supposed to be representations of real animals, Mr. Marks," Mr. Stewart had said. "How do you know there aren't any four-headed octopuses?" Devin had responded. "Only 5% of the ocean floor has been explored." That had shut Mr. Stewart up. Devin didn't like reading books, but that didn't mean he didn't read. He spent most of his spare time on the internet. Mick stuffed the second cupcake in his mouth. The boy started walking away from the school. Mick took a noisy slurp through his straw. "That was a skeevy short story, Dev. Kind of made me throw up in my mouth." Devin gave Mick a gentle shove. "Gross." "Not grosser than your story." "Whatever. Did you see what Heather did, though? She was, really white. Her face, I mean. I thought she was going to faint." "Yeah, but did you see her look at me?" Mick glanced at Devin, who bent down to pick up a round stone. He flung it at a stop sign, and it hit the middle of the O with a resounding metal clink. I saw her look at you like she wanted to kill you." "Nah, didn't you hear what she said?" Mick adjusted his backpack. "Yep, she said the story was sick." "No, she said it was sick, as in cool." Mick screwed up his round face. I don't think so." Devin shrugged again, picked up another rock, and fired it at a lamppost. He got a resonant bong as a reward. "The point is that she noticed me. She talked to me." Mick twisted his small mouth. "That's something?" "It sure is." The boys reached the railroad yard that was 1/2 mile from their school. They began weaving through the stationary, graffiti-covered boxcars. The railway yard smelled like oil and creosote, and it was filled with the sounds of train wheels clunking lethargically over dirty old rails. At the far side of the yard, the boys ducked into the woods that stretched for miles to the north beyond the railroad yard, and from several miles east of the yard to the back of the neighborhood to the west. The woods were thick with huge fir and hemlock trees that stood so closely together in places that they blocked out the sun, creating perpetual dusk. On a cloudy day, the forest was even darker, like it was one big shadow engulfing and muting the too loud, too bright, too busy craziness that most people called real life. Devin loved the darkness. On a sunny day like today, it was a relief to duck into the trees and leave the blazing light behind. Halfway from the railroad yard to the neighborhood, if they stayed near the edge of the woods, they'd reach their clubhouse, the hangout they had set up in an old abandoned gas station that backed onto the woods. For the 6 years they'd been friends, they'd spent nearly every afternoon after school and much of every weekend in their clubhouse. If Devin was honest, which he wasn't, he thought they were getting a little old to have a clubhouse. It was fine when they were in grade school and maybe even last year in middle school, but now that they were nearly at the end of their freshman year, it was too little kid for them. Devin had outgrown their pretend games of pirates and space cowboys, and he no longer saw the collection of junk they'd amassed over the years as treasures. He didn't want to be one of two boys who had no place to go after school other than a tumbling down empty gas station. But that didn't mean he had a problem with their clubhouse. It might not be little kid fun for him anymore, but it was a place to get away from all the crap of real life. It was a place he could go and forget about school, and forget about the pressure his mom was always putting on him to be somebody. "Don't end up like me, Devin. Be somebody," she told him over and over and over and over and... "Don't you think?" Mick asked. What? How long had he been walking along not listening to his friend? Devin had no idea what he'd missed, but he figured it probably wasn't important. Mick's latest favorite subject of conversation was the digital math game he was working on. "It's going to be like playing Spy, like with ciphers," Mick had explained to Devin. Mick and Devin got mostly B's and C's, peppered with the occasional D at school. That wasn't, however, because they were stupid. They weren't. Devin just never cared enough about school to apply himself, his mother's words. School bored him. Why work hard at it? Mick's problem was a little more serious. He had some learning disorders Devin didn't really understand, and he tended to have attention issues. "We're not going to label that boy," Mick's father said, according to Mick, so Mick had never been treated for anything. Basically, as far as Devin could tell, Mick was like a savant who couldn't figure out how to play the school game, and Mick didn't care about the school game. He was in love with food, the reason for his soft, slightly pudgy form, and fantasy worlds of any kind. Mick was an overgrown kid, almost as tall as Devin. Mick's high-waisted corduroy pants and button-down short-sleeve shirts screamed nerd, but it didn't seem to bother him. Devin figured someday Mick would probably own a gaming company and be a zillionaire. "Devin!" Mick yanked on Devin's t-shirt sleeve. "What?" Mick blinked and looked around. They should be at the clubhouse by now. Yep, there was the old cedar tree with the split trunk, so... Where was the gas station? "It's gone," Mick said in a very small voice. He was right. The gas station was no longer there. In its place, a hulking yellow backhoe sat idled next to a mass of debris, like a dragon waiting to spew fire at its defeated foe. Mick plopped down on a fallen log. "But," he blinked and sniffed, "our treasures." Devin, who was feeling strangely thrilled by the demolished clubhouse, looked down at his friend. Mick's large brown eyes were moist. He rubbed his nose. Devin took a seat next to Mick and threw an arm around his shoulders. "Hey, it's okay." "But it's not. Look." "Yeah, I'm looking." "All our treasures," Mick repeated. "Yeah, but we can find more." Not that Devin wanted to, but Mick didn't need to know that. "But we have no clubhouse now." Devin gave Mick a half hug, glad nobody could see them. "I'll find us something." "You think so?" "Sure. And in the meantime, we have the forest." He waved an arm behind them. "Well, yeah, that'll work on days like today, but leave it to me," Devin said. "For now, let's just hang out here. No matter what, we're in it together, right?" He held out his right index finger. Mick grinned and nodded. "In it together." He extended his right index finger and linked it with Devin's. They both pulled hard and then released. Devin shrugged out of his backpack and unzipped the outer pocket. "I saved the chocolate chip cookie for my lunch. It's yours if you want it." Mick brightened. "Really? Far out." Devin inwardly rolled his eyes. He was used to Mick's habit of using out-of-date or even made-up slang, but that didn't mean he always liked it. While Mick munched on the cookie, Devin said, "I think today's a big day. Maybe that," he waved at the pile of destroyed gas station, "is a sign that something new is coming. Something big. I mean, after all, Heather talked to me today. All I have to do now is build on that and figure out other ways to get her attention." Mick stopped chewing. He brushed cookie crumbs off his chin. I'm not sure getting her attention is necessarily a good thing. There are different kinds of attention, right?" Devin shrugged. Whatever. Devin was happy with how his plan unfolded today. He wasn't going to let Mick talk him off his high. "Hey," he said, "why don't we go poke around that pile and see if we can find some of our stuff?" Mick, who had finished the cookie, grinned. Mrs. Patterson seemed to be bearing a grudge about Devin's story. Instead of ignoring him like normal, she glared at him as he took his usual place in the back of the room next to Mick. Heather wasn't here yet. As soon as Devin sat down, Mick leaned over and poked him in the arm. "Hey, Dev, you need to meet Kelsey." Mick leaned back and pointed at a new kid sitting on Mick's left. "Kelsey, this is Devin. Dev, this is Kelsey." "Hey." "Hey," Kelsey said. He flashed Devin what looked like a genuine, friendly smile. "Really?" Devin had spotted Kelsey earlier that morning. He'd been hanging out near the stairs watching the other kids. Both then and now, Devin thought Kelsey didn't look like the kind of kid who would be friendly with Mick and Devin. Although Devin didn't dress with nerdy abandon like Mick did, he in no way resembled a normal kid. Too skinny for his height, Devin knew he had a lot of things working against him. His teeth were super crooked, and his mom couldn't afford to get him braces. His ears were too big, even though he wore his dark hair long and messy as possible. The ears still wanted to stick out. His neck was too long, and his dark eyes were way too small and way too close together. When he was in grade school, one of the school bullies called him Birdman. His mom liked to say he was a dormant swan. Yeah, whatever. But here was this new kid, this very good-looking, Devin knew what girls looked for in boys, new kid, smiling at Devin as if Devin were someone worth smiling at. Devin had seen Kelsey smile at lots of kids the same way when he was on the stairs. Kelsey's smile made Devin feel ridiculously good. "Kelsey just moved here," Mick said. Devin resisted the urge to say, duh. His dad's a contractor," Mick continued. "He's here to head up that hotel office complex my dad bid on and didn't get." His grin and bright eyes made it clear he didn't intend any spite in these words. Even so, Devin noticed Kelsey's smile faltered for a second. Devin had no idea what to say to that, so he just said, "Okay." It was bad enough that Mick had just mentioned his often out-of-work dad, who liked to grouse about how other electricians were always outbidding him. But Devin hoped this conversation wasn't going to end up with him having to say what his mom did. She was a house cleaner. She didn't even have her own house cleaning business. She worked for someone else. She barely made enough money for them to live on. But she seemed to think he should be proud that they were making it. He wasn't. "I invited Kelsey to sit with us at lunch," Mick said. "Sure," Devin said, not at all sure Kelsey would actually want to sit with them. Kelsey grinned. "I appreciate the invite." Devin raised an eyebrow and scanned Kelsey's wavy blonde hair, blue eyes, straight teeth, broad shoulders, cool ripped jeans, and faded black t-shirt. "Sure," he repeated. The disjointed sounds of multiple conversations, the swish of clothes, the scraping of chairs, and the thudding of books on desks let Devin know the classroom was filling up. He got a whiff of Heather's lemony scent, and he swiveled in his seat to stare at the sleek shine of her straight auburn hair. She was wearing a dark green shirt that went great with her hair. "Okay, cease and desist with the chaos," Mrs. Patterson said. "Let's begin." To Devin's shock, Kelsey did actually sit with Mick and him during lunch. It was another bright day, and everyone was outside, either clustered at the picnic tables set up near the entrance at the cafeteria, or lounging on the grass that stretched from the walkway in front of the school to the parking lot. Devin and Mick leaned against the base of the stone wall surrounding the flagposts. The stone was rough but warm. Devin was looking for Heather, and Mick was going on about how delicious peanut butter and honey sandwiches were, when Kelsey strolled over and dropped to a cross-legged position in front of them. Devin glanced up and around them to see if anyone was looking at this shocking social development. Several people were. A couple of the jocks called out, "Hey, Kelsey," as they strutted past. Kelsey smiled at them. "Hey, Kurt. Hey, Brian." He also waved at a group of girls to the closest picnic table, and they waved back. Then he turned his attention to Mick and Devin. "I hear the food here sucks, so I brought my own lunch," he said. Mick waved around his delicious sandwich and said in a peanut butter mushmouth, "It's the best choice." Kelsey laughed. He actually laughed. Not like as if he was laughing at Mick, but like he thought Mick was amusing. He opened a crumpled brown paper bag. "I like a good old chicken salad," he said. "My mom makes great chicken salad." He gestured at Devon's sack. "What do you have?" Devon shrugged. "I'm not actually hungry." He pushed his sack down into his backpack. The truth was he had bologna on white bread. His mom bought both in bulk, and he hated both. He hated the taste. And he hated that they reminded him of grade school, when he thought bologna was the best thing in the world. He'd outgrown the food, but their budget hadn't kept up with his taste buds. Kelsey bit into a sandwich and looked around. "I like it here. I like the sun." "See, Dev, normal people like the sun," Mick nudged Devon with a foot and said to Kelsey. "Dev likes the clouds. If I didn't know better, I think he was a vampire." Kelsey tilted his head and studied Devon for a couple seconds. For those 2 seconds, Devon had the weird feeling he was being evaluated. But then Kelsey laughed and leaned toward Devon. "Well, he doesn't sparkle in the sun like those movie vampires." He laughed again. "Probably not a vampire." Devon said in a creepy vampire accent, "I don't want to suck your blood." "Hey, Kelsey," a girl's bell-like voice called out. Devon sat up straight. It was Heather. "Hi, Heather," Kelsey said. "You find that book I was telling you about?" She stood a few feet from them and beamed down at Kelsey. "I did. I'm going to start it tonight." She flicked a glance at Mick and Devon. "Oh, hi, Devon." The tone of Heather's voice when she said hi to Devon was tonally different than the one she used for Kelsey. Devon noticed that, of course. Part of his brain told him that the sharp and heavy tones on each syllable of his name represented sarcasm. Part of his brain didn't care. It only cared that she said hi to him. "Hi, Heather." She wrinkled her nose at him, flashed a big smile at Kelsey, and walked away. "Pretty girl," Kelsey said softly after Heather had moved off. He watched her for a few seconds, then scanned the rest of the students, his gaze resting now and then on someone before moving on. "Yeah," Mick said. "Devon thinks, yeah, she is." Devon interrupted. He turned and gave Mick a look that clearly said, "Shut up." Mick was sharp enough to quietly return to his sandwich. Kelsey started talking about the experiment they'd done in science class, and Devon tuned out. He watched Heather talking animatedly with her friends while he half listened to Kelsey and Mick discuss chemical reagents. Was this what it was like to actually fit in? Maybe not quite, but it was closer than he'd gotten in years. Devon pretty much floated through the rest of the day. He hadn't felt this good in a very long time. He even raised his hand once in math and answered a question correctly. Mr. Crenshaw's mouth dropped open. On his way through school to meet Mick after his last class, Devon passed Heather and her friends loitering by the lockers. Heather stood with her back in the hallway. Her friends formed a semicircle in front of her. There was Valerie and Juliet, along with her third BFF, Gabriella. Gabriella's boyfriend, Quincy, also stood nearby. For some reason Devon didn't understand, Quincy always seemed to be hanging out with the girls. "I've decided I'm going to make my own movies," Heather flung her hair back over her shoulder. "I don't want to be an actress. I want to be behind the camera." Devon didn't think. He just stopped next to Heather and started talking. Ignoring Heather's friends, he pushed in sideways in front of Heather and said, "If you're going to make movies, you should do horror movies. Even campy horror movies can get good followings." Heather took a step back and looked Devon up and down. He kept talking. "If you decide to do horror movies, let me know. I have a cousin who has clown makeup and costumes. You could do a creepy clown story." Heather tapped a red-nailed index finger against Devon's chest, emphasizing each word with what could have been scorn, but maybe not. She pronounced, "You are unoriginal. That's been done, done, done." She turned and flounced off. Her friends followed, but not before Valerie, her blonde curls bouncing as she shook her head at Devon, said, "You're very weird." Devon watched them walk away as he rubbed the spot Heather touched. She touched him. As Mick and Devon headed away from school, Mick waited for Devon to talk about his search for a new clubhouse, but Devon didn't talk about that. "She actually touched me," Devon was saying. He'd just finished telling Mick about how he'd talked to Heather in the hall. It sounded to Mick like Devon had made himself look like a total doofus, but Devon didn't see it that way. Devon actually thought Heather's comment and her fingertip to the chest were worth getting excited about. Mick was a little worried about Devon. It seemed like he was getting just a bit delusional. It wasn't that Mick thought Devon didn't deserve to get Heather's attention. Sure he did. Mick's parents had taught him that looks don't mean anything, and everyone is equally deserving of love and other good stuff. Mick had to admit he wasn't really sure the world worked that way. He hadn't seen evidence of this attitude in school for sure, but he trusted his parents. A bee buzzed past Mick's nose, and he jumped back and waved his Go cup in front of his face. The liquid inside sloshed around. He watched Devon throw a rock at the coupling on the end of the boxcars. He hit it dead on. but he was missing big time with his conclusions about Heather. Devin's latest conversational attempt was a swing and a very, very big miss. Mick grinned. His dad would be proud of the sports metaphor. Mick hadn't liked sports when he was younger, but lately he'd been getting into baseball, which his dad loved. Mick liked the stats. As Mick and Devin ducked into the woods, Mick said, Dev, what's going on with looking for a new clubhouse? Huh? Devin had been talking about Heather's hair. He blinked and looked at Mick. A new clubhouse? Mick repeated. Oh, right. I'm still looking for something good. But in the meantime, I stashed a blanket, a tarp, and some ropes in the woods early this morning. I thought we could build a fort and make it like our camp. Mick grinned. But Donkadonk, that's the boss. Mick noticed Devin's sigh. He knew Devin didn't like his expressions, but he didn't care. They made Mick happy, and Mick liked to do whatever he could to be happy. He was pretty sure Devin thought Mick didn't care about fitting in at school, but Mick did care. He cared so much it actually hurt him to think about how much everyone ignored them both. But the alternative, putting themselves out there and being rejected, was decidedly something Mick didn't want. He and Devin both used to deal with it in the same way, by ignoring everyone else and doing their own thing. Now Devin seemed to want to fit in. Now Devin seemed to want to try to fit in, while Mick still wanted to stay in his fantasy world. The fantasy world felt good. The real world definitely did not. A few minutes later, they reached a small stand of hemlocks sheltering a couple of boulders. Devin went to one of the boulders and pulled out a blanket, a tarp, and some rope. Between the two of them, they managed to string up the top to form a lopsided and sagging roof, and they spread the blanket on the ground between the boulders. So let's brainstorm, Dev said when they'd settled, and Mick had offered him a barbecue potato chip from the bag he brought from the vending machine after school. Every day his mom gave him money to get some kind of junk food from that machine. It was his reward for getting through another day. Some days he got something sugary, and when he did, he usually ate it immediately. Some days he got something salty, and he usually saved that to share with Devin. About the clubhouse? Mick asked. Is that what we're brainstorming? Devin crunched a chip and said, What? No, about Heather and how I can get in with her more. Dude, I'm still not sure you're getting in with her yet. Devin ignored Mick. I need to find a way to impress her, he said. That's never a good idea, Mick said. What isn't? Doing something to try to impress someone. My mom says that's when boys make stupid mistakes. Devin flicked a rock at a fern growing at the base of one of the trees holding up their tarp. Well, who cares about what your mom says? I do? Yeah, well, you shouldn't. How about we talk about the hike we're going to do on Saturday? Mick asked. Dad says if we go a couple miles farther north than we normally go, we'll find a pretty jiggy waterfall. Maybe we should scout out locations for her movies, Devin said. I could give her a list of good locations. That should make her happy. Apparently there's some kind of rare plant that grows next to the waterfall, Mick tried again. It would be cool beans to find it. Why would Heather want beans? Devin said. Mick laughed, but then he realized Devin was serious. He hadn't been listening to anything Mick said. Mick sighed. It was like Devin had been put under a witch's spell. Mick wondered how he could break it. To Devin's amazement, Kelsey met Devin and Mick for lunch again the next day. He even brought his new friends chicken salad sandwiches. I thought you'd like to try them, Kelsey said. Mom makes her own bread too. It's pretty awesome. Today the weather was more to Devin's liking. So many cloud tufts clustered overhead they blocked out most of the sun. Hey, Kelsey said, jerking his thumb toward the sky. Your kind of weather. He remembered that. Devin smiled. Yeah. Devin had watched Kelsey in the two classes they shared. It seemed like Kelsey was making friends with every kid in the class. How did he do that? Was it just because he was good-looking? Was it the clothes? Today he wore baggy black pants with a gray t-shirt. He had a black and red plaid shirt tied at his waist. Devin never cared about his clothes enough to know what was right and what was wrong to wear. There was no reason to care. His mom could afford to get him 2 pairs of jeans and a bunch of t-shirts every year. That limited his fashion choices. So do you know all the cloud types? Kelsey asked. We learned them in school last year, and the only one I can remember is stratus. What are those? He gestured overhead. Cumulus, Devin said without thinking. Maybe that was it. Kelsey talked to you like he actually cared about what you were into. Did he really care, or was it an act? Devin narrowed his eyes and studied Kelsey as Kelsey asked Mick about Mick's superhero watch. I saw that latest movie, Kelsey said. It was dope. Kelsey was starting to get on Devin's nerves. Wait a minute. What? Why? Devin frowned. Why was Kelsey bugging him? He should be glad the new kid was hanging out with them. He was glad. But he was annoyed, too. It just came so easily to Kelsey. Too easily. It wasn't fair. Devin snorted. Mick and Kelsey looked at him. What? Mick said. Oh, sorry, just a stupid thought, not important. Kelsey cocked his head and looked at Devin so hard it felt like Kelsey was looking into his soul. Then Kelsey grinned and nodded, as if he understood exactly. But how could he? Don't you just hate it when your brain goes and comes up with stupid thoughts? Mine does that all the time, Kelsey said. It's like it has a mind of its own. He laughed. Mick laughed too. Brain has a mind of its own. That's a good one. Devin forced a chuckle. Yeah, He actually had been laughing at himself because he sounded like a baby when he thought it wasn't fair. As if. By now, he of all people should know life wasn't fair. What do you guys do after school? Kelsey asked. I've been looking into what's available and haven't decided what to get into yet. Devin didn't want to answer that question. He and Mick weren't involved in any sports or clubs. Except their club, of 2. They had nothing. Mick wasn't intimidated by the question. With naive honesty, he said, We had this clubhouse, this really cool hangout in an abandoned gas station, but they tore it down. Dev said he's going to look for a new place for us. Kelsey finished his sandwich and wiped his mouth with a black napkin. Who used black napkins? A hangout, he leaned forward. Well, the best places for hangouts are abandoned buildings. My friends and I at my last school really got into urban exploring. We found some cool spots. When I learned I was coming here, I asked one of my buddies to let me know if there's anything around here worth checking out. He's looking into it. Cool, Mick said. But until then, I can still help with the hangout thing. You can? Mick finished his sandwich too, but didn't wipe off the chicken salad smeared on his cheek. Kelsey pointed at it, and without making fun, he said, You got a little smudge there. Oh, thanks. Mick wiped his face with the back of his hand. Kelsey smiled. My parents bought up this huge old farmhouse right outside of town. Mom says it's historical or something. I don't care about that, but I do like that there's this big old workshop behind the house. It's a mess, like sagging and starting to fall apart, and it needs paint and a new roof and stuff. Dad's building a home office and shop on the other side of the house, so he said I could have the workshop for a hangout place for parties and whatever if I fix it up. Want to help me? Dad said he'd buy all the supplies. I just have to do the work. He taught me so I know how to build things, but it's more fun with friends. We could redo the workshop and make it our hangout. Did he really just say it's more fun with friends? Devin was tempted to stab Kelsey and see if he was a robot. Mick didn't seem to have a problem with it. He was practically bouncing. That's the bee's knees. Kelsey laughed. Glad you think so. He grinned at Devin. How about you? Knees, Devin said dryly as possible, but he smiled. That does sound pretty great. And it did. Even though he resented how easily Kelsey was sliding into their class, he had to admit it would be awesome if being friends with Kelsey got them a ticket to the inner circle. If they helped him build the hangout and Kelsey had parties, they'd be invited. Great, Kelsey said. He pulled out his phone and sent a text. There's this old guy, George, a neighbor I've made friends with. I just texted him to see if he can take us to the building supply store after school tomorrow. He told me he could drive me whenever I needed it. A couple seconds later, Kelsey's phone played a guitar riff. He glanced at it. Yep, he's in. He glanced at his watch and stood. Mick and Devin stood too. It was time to get to class. Meet us tomorrow after school by the flagpoles, Kelsey said. Dad has a big dually pickup truck with an extra cab. Plenty of room for us all. It's bright red. You won't be able to miss it. Capital, my man, Mick said in a fake British accent. Kelsey laughed and offered Mick a fist a bump. Jolly good, he played along. He offered his fist to Devin too. Devin bumped it and said, See ya, as they went into the school. He noticed and ignored the flutter in his belly as he got his books from his locker. He was excited about Kelsey's offer, but he wasn't sure it was a good idea to get too revved up about it. Life had a way of disappointing him. Maybe things were going to turn around, though. As Heather swished past and gave him a chilly stare, he let himself believe in the possibility of change. Mick was so hyped he could barely sit still. He hadn't been able to sleep the night before because he was too excited about helping Kelsey build the new clubhouse. Or, okay, hangout. Clubhouse, hangout, whatever. His mom had noticed Mick had dark circles under his eyes when he got up, so she'd let him have a cup of coffee. Now he was on a caffeine high. He'd talked Devin's ear off on the way up to school, and in every class, his leg had bounced like a basketball dribbled by a pro. Whoa, there was another sports metaphor, and he didn't even like basketball. How about that? It was the third period of the day. They were in social studies. Not his favorite class, but he'd endure. As usual, Mick and Devin sat in the back of the classroom with the map-lined walls and stern Mr. Gentry looming over the kids in the front row. Mick noticed Kelsey was at the end of the third row, sitting next to a couple of football players. Kelsey was leaning back in his chair sideways, so he was looking at the kids on the left side of the room instead of at Mr. Gentry up front. Mick watched as Kelsey's gaze landed on Devin and Mick. Kelsey gave them a little half smile and nodded. "Today," Mr. Gentry said, "we're talking about justice." He peered over his black, thick-rimmed reading glasses, which generally hung on the end of his beaky nose. Mick thought Mr. Gentry looked a little like an eagle. He had white hair, and he usually wore brown. He had close-set eyes like Devin did, and then there was that nose. "What is justice?" Mr. Gentry asked. No one raised their hands. I know a rhetorical question when I hear one, Mick thought. "Every culture has its own concept of justice," Mr. Gentry continued. "This concept is generally derived from many fields of study. Our system of justice, for example, comes from ethics, rational thought, the law, religion, and just general ideas about fairness. Underlying all of that, though, is usually some kind of gut feeling. Justice is, in most cases, intuitive. We know it when we feel it." He looked out over the class. "So what does justice mean to you?" This wasn't a rhetorical question. Mick didn't even think about raising his hand, though. Raising his hand in class would require that he have a brain transplant, or maybe get possessed, or be infected by an alien symbiote. Kelsey raised his hand and said, "Justice balances the scales." "What does that mean?" Mr. Gentry asked. "It removes the downside, so the downside can't outweigh the upside." "Interesting perspective," Mr. Gentry said. Heather raised her hand. Mick frowned. Heather. What was it about Heather that fascinated Devin so much? Sure, she was pretty, but she seemed pretty shallow to Mick, and she wasn't that pretty. There were much prettier girls in the class. He thought Devin was a little crazy about Heather, though Devin seemed a little scrambled in general. Mick was beginning to think maybe Devin had picked up a symbiote. There was something in his eyes, something not quite right. "I think justice is payback," Heather said. "Payback," Mr. Gentry repeated. "Yeah," Heather said. "Like someone disses you, so you have to diss them back." "Payback seems a little vague," Mr. Gentry said. "Perhaps it's too open to interpretation. What if payback goes too far?" Heather shrugged. "Accidents happen." She laughed, and the class laughed with her. Devin laughed the loudest. Mick noticed Kelsey wasn't laughing. Mick wasn't laughing either. A shiver slithered down his spine. Devin didn't think the day would ever end. Every class was slow and boring, with social studies winning the prize. Except for Heather's hilarious accidents happen comment. The rest of the class had been drier than his mother's roast chicken, which was so dry it was hard to believe the bird had ever been alive at all. But finally, the day was over, and he and Mick were headed to the front of the school to meet Kelsey. The front of the school. How awesome was that? No more sneaking out the back to a clubhouse for losers. Mick trotted up to Devin just inside the main doors of the school. Kids jostled past them, running for buses. For once, Devin didn't find the Friday afternoon buzz in the air annoying. He felt the buzz, too, like little electrical eels skimming over his skin. He noticed that Mick had been acting like he was plugged into a light socket all day. He was jittery and spastic, but Devin understood. He also felt strangely happy about everything. For once, he was enjoying the yellow walls in the school hall, which most of the time reminded him of uncooked egg yolk and made him want to gag. He wasn't minding all the school odors, the chemical smell of the carpet, the dusty smell of chalk, the sweat, the bubblegum, the garlic breath from that day's school's lunch. Instead of feeling foreign, it felt familiar. "Are you ready?" Mick asked, plucking at Devin's sleeve. Devin grinned. "Ready." They pushed their way through the double glass doors and both scanned the driveway for a bright red dually truck. Kelsey had been right. They couldn't miss it. They headed toward it and met up with Kelsey as he trotted over from the gym. "You're here." Kelsey sounded genuinely pleased. Devin was surprised. Kelsey raised a hand and waved it at a bearded man behind the wheel of the truck. The man waved back, smiling. Devin wondered what it was like to have an adult male smiling at you. No, seriously, let's tell the truth here. He wondered what it would be like to have an adult male, say, like a dad, around. Period. The only memory he had of his dad was of an angry man who threw things at his mom. Devin was 3 when his dad took off. He and his mom had been alone ever since. Kelsey led Devin and Mick to the pickup. Devin noticed a few kids gave Mick and him looks, like they were cavemen who'd escaped the Stone Age. A paper airplane sailed by Devin's head, barely missing his nose. He didn't bother to turn and see where it came from. He kept his gaze on the massive red pickup truck. "Hey, George," Kelsey said when they reached the back of the truck. He and George did an elaborate finger flutter into a shoulder bump. "This is Devin," Kelsey nodded at Devin, "and Mick." "Nice to meet you, sir." Mick thrust out his hand and dropped the books he'd tucked under his arm. Before Devin could reach for them, Kelsey bent down to pick them up. George, who looked to be fit 60-something, shook Mick's hand. "No need for this, sir. Call me George." He turned to Devin and offered his hand. Devin shook it. It was thick and calloused. "Hi, George." Kelsey stacked Mick's books and handed them back to Mick. Mick shifted them and grinned. "Thanks." "Okay," George said. "How about—" "Hey, Kelsey," Heather's voice rang out. Devin whirled to look at her. She was wearing a tight, bright red shirt today. He'd spent most of English class staring at it, and he was happy to see it again now. Heather ignored his stare, but Gabriella gave Devin a heavy-lidded look, designed to make him feel like a worm. He made an ugly face at her, and she clutched Quincy, who pulled her close and said to George, "Nice rig." "Thanks." George grinned and patted the hood of his pickup like it was a dog. "I've got a 6.2-liter V8 under the hood here. 420 horsepower and 460 pounds of torque." "Whoa," Quincy said. "Sweet." He leaned against the front of the truck like he was posing for an ad. Gabriella giggled and posed next to him. Devin's jaw clenched. Quincy and Gabriella were the prettiest people in school. Gabriella was Hispanic, and she might actually someday get to be a star she told everyone she was going to be. She was that beautiful. Quincy, dark-haired but with lighter skin, had the bad boy look Devin had once tried to pull off by slashing gashes into his jeans, tearing at his t-shirts, and slouching more. It didn't work for Devin. All he got was a lecture from his mom on taking care of his stuff and standing up straight. "What are you doing this weekend, Kelsey?" Heather asked. Kelsey gestured toward Mick and Devin. "We're going to the building supply store to get what we need so we can turn an old workshop into a great hangout spot." Heather flicked a glance at Devin, then smiled at Kelsey. "That sounds fun. I love DIY. Kelsey smiled. "That's cool." Heather laid a hand on Kelsey's arm. "You know, I'm a really good designer. I helped my mom do a surprise man cave for my dad." She turned towards her friends. "Remember building those wall-to-wall bookshelves?" The three girls laughed, poking one another in delight over some private joke. Devin wanted to throw up. Valerie, a very small girl who wore enough makeup for 10 girls, had a nasally voice that turned into a honk when she laughed. And Juliet, tall and slender, had a little girl giggle that made Devin's teeth hurt. Quincy pushed off from the truck. "I've got mad hammering skills." Kelsey looked at Quincy with no expression for a second, then he smiled and went, "That's great." Devin didn't think Kelsey thought it was great. He seemed annoyed. But why? Heather took Kelsey's hand. "How about you have a building party this weekend? We can all come and help." Kelsey opened his mouth, but before he said anything, George grinned and said, "Hey, that sounds great. I can help set up a barbecue." Heather gestured at the truck. "Then let's go get some supplies." Kelsey looked from Heather and her friends to Mick and Devin. Heather went on. "Quincy's brother was going to take us home, but he had some place to be. We could go with you to the supply store, and then maybe you could run us home?" "Sure," George said. "Be happy to, but—" He looked at the group of them. "You're not all gonna fit." Heather said, "Sure we will. There are only 5 of us, plus you and Kelsey." 7, plus me and Kelsey, George said, gesturing at Devin and Mick. Heather glanced at Devin and Mick. She waved a hand in the air. "Oh, they can ride in the back." "Nope, sorry," George said. "That's against the law." From the moment Heather and the crew had shown up, Devin had felt like he was watching the scene unfold inside of a glass cocoon. He got what everyone was saying, could hear the girls' annoying laughter, but it was all muted. Even though they were standing just a few feet from Devin, they felt very far away, almost like he was watching them on a movie screen. His other senses seemed to have been turned off. He could no longer smell the bus exhaust belching out of the buses accelerated away from school. He couldn't feel the clothes on his body or the pavement under his feet. Now it felt like fog was rolling into his little cocoon, and it was seeping inside of him, putting his brain in murk that made thinking nearly impossible. Maybe that was why he was so surprised when he saw Mick step forward and say to Kelsey, I thought just me and Devin were going with you today." Kelsey frowned and looked at everyone. Devin knew the problem. Kelsey was asking himself, should I be a jerk and blow off the 2 losers, or should I ignore the pretty girls? It wasn't going to be a tough choice. Kelsey was still holding Heather's hand. George spoke up. "How about this? We'll do 2 trips. I'll take some of you kids over there, then I'll come back for the rest. It's only a 10-minute drive. The wait won't be that long." Kelsey released a pent-up breath. "Thanks, George." Heather grinned at Kelsey and pulled him toward the pickup's passenger door. Come on, we can share the front seat. I'm small enough that we can both fit under the seatbelt, she giggled. Kelsey shrugged and let Heather lead him to the front of the pickup. The others piled in the back of the pickup. Quincy pushed Mick back as he squeezed in after the 3 other girls. For a second, it looked like George was going to protest the number of kids in the back seat, but then he shrugged and got behind the wheel. All 4 doors slammed. George put his window down. I'll be back for you, boys. As soon as George started his 6.2-liter V8 whatever that meant engine, Devin's cocoon collapsed. He actually felt his ears pop as the air around him seemed to adjust to real space and time again. His senses went on high alert, too. The first thing he smelled was the grape soda in Mick's Go Cup. Then he got a whiff of gasoline as the big red truck drove away with Devin's short-lived optimism. He knew it was too good to be true. He felt Mick tug at his shirt. Want to sit over there and wait? Mick pointed at the curb and sucked through his straw. He plunked his padded rump on the curb and piled his backpack and extra books next to him. A car full of kids blasted past them, and someone let out a shrill whistle. Someone else shouted, "Losers!" Devin put his back to the driveway. He turned towards the woods and said, "I'm not waiting. I'm going home." Mick pulled his mouth from his straw. His upper lip was stained purple. Why?" Devin glanced down at Mick. He looked pathetic sitting there with his Go Cup. Devin wanted to snap at him and walk away, but 10 years of friendship and thousands of in-it-together fingerlinks kept his temper somewhat under control. "Seriously? You're asking me why?" Mick frowned, then nodded. Devin sighed and sat down on the curb next to Mick. "Do you really think that after the 30 minutes it will take for George to drive them there, come back for us, and then get us there, we're going to be welcomed into the group? Don't you think it might be just a little bit, and I'm being very, very sarcastic right now in case you're missing it, awkward?" Mick had to think about that for several seconds. Devin waited. Finally, Mick sighed. "Yeah, I see what you mean." He sniffed and sucked on his straw. "Why did Kelsey do that? Why didn't he have them wait?" "Again, seriously? You're asking that? Did you not see him make a move on Heather?" Mick twisted his lips and looked up at the corner of his eyes, as if watching a replay on a tiny screen up and off to the right. He frowned. "I thought she made a move on him." "Whatever. He went along when she suggested they share the front seat." Mick thought that over and nodded. "True." Devin stood. "So are you coming with me or not?" Mick sighed. "Yeah, I guess so." He lifted his backpack and Devin picked up Mick's extra stack of books. "Does this mean we can't have our clubhouse at Kelsey's house?" Mick asked as they started walking toward the woods. "Yes, I think that's exactly what this means." Mick was still feeling a little bummed about what happened with Kelsey when he met Devin for their hike on Saturday morning. He'd try not to let things bother him too much. If he did, he'd be miserable all the time. He didn't really want to be miserable. Mick and Devin lived in a neighborhood that wasn't as nice as Mick wished it was. It wasn't awful. He'd seen much worse, but it wasn't good either. Left over from when the town was owned by the logging company, the houses in their neighborhood were small, old, and pretty much identical, except for the cars and junk that sat next to them. When Mick and his parents moved into their house, they told Mick it was just temporary. He wouldn't have to share his room with his little sister forever. But he was still sharing his room with his little sister, Debbie, something that was bearable only because Debbie, who liked to sew, made a curtain to divide their tiny room. That and the fact that they both had earphones and mostly spent the time reading or on their own computers kept them from wanting to kill each other. Sometimes Mick envied Devin because Devin had his own room, but then he remembered Devin didn't have a dad. Not even a lazy dad who never made enough money. At least Mick had a dad, and his dad loved him. That was better than his own room, he guessed. Mick, his backpack filled with junk food, snacks, sodas, water, his little camera, and extra sunscreen, trotted up the cracked and dusty walk to Devin's faded blue front door. All the houses in the neighborhood had gray siding and blue front doors. Some were brighter than others. Mick was almost afraid to knock on the door. What if Devin wasn't there? The way Devin had been acting the night before made Mick wonder. Devin was becoming less and less of the friend Mick was used to. It was like something was nibbling on Devin from the inside. It was eating up his smiles and, well, his personality. Mick blinked when the blue door opened. "Hi, Miss Marks," he said to the tall, skinny woman with the short, mussed, dark hair. Mrs. Marks wore a pale yellow uniform shirt with the dark blue uniform pants. Her brown eyes had circles under them, and her thin lips were pressed together. When she saw Mick, she managed to half smile. "He's almost ready, Mick." Devin appeared behind his mom. Mick noticed the house smelled like oatmeal and lemons. "You boys have fun today," Mrs. Marks said. Devin lifted his backpack and grinned. "We will." Mick almost did a double take. Devin sounded downright enthusiastic about their hike. Was the old Devin back? If so, that would be coolio. The waterfall was where Mick's dad had promised it would be, and it was as jiggy as he'd promised. The boys found a big flat rock near the base of the falls, just far back enough to be out of spray range, but close enough to see the thrashing froth roiling around at the base of the falls. The falls weren't that tall, but they were wide and pretty powerful, probably because it was spring and they were fed by winter snow runoff. Mick loved hearing the water roar as it plunged from the top of the bluff to the stone basin below. The falls were tucked into a stand of fir trees that enclosed the space around the falls. It felt like the boys were in a lush green cave in a distant land. It was pretty magical, Mick thought. He wouldn't have been surprised if squirrels and chipmunks came dancing out of the woods and broke into song. Of course, he knew that wasn't going to happen, but the falls made it seem possible. Devin's mood made it seem possible, too. Devin had been pumped up all morning. He had this, what was it? Swag. It was swag. He was acting like he was all that. It was loony. Mick had to admit, though, that he liked this Devin better than the one who had been making him nervous over the last few days. Yes, Devin was still obsessing over that girl, Heather, but at least he was talking and smiling. Devin stood up and took a picture of the tallest fir tree beyond the falls. "I'm thinking this would make a great location for a scene in one of Heather's movies," Devin said. "Uh-huh." Mick had no idea what to say when Devin talked about Heather. Pointing out that Heather clearly didn't like Devin didn't seem to do any good. So he was using his mom's NASAMLN technique. Nod and smile and make listening noises. Devin took a couple more pictures, and then he sat down and pulled a package of crackers with peanut butter out of his backpack. He nudged Mick. "I have a surprise for you." "Did you bring dessert?" Mick had eaten his packaged cupcakes already, and he was still hungry. Devin laughed. No dessert, sorry. But I did find us a new clubhouse." Mick sat up straight. "Really? Where?" "That's part of the surprise. I did what Kelsey suggested. I looked for abandoned places near here, and I found one. I'll take you there on Monday after school." "Why not today?" Devin grinned in a sly way that made Mick's breath catch for a second. "It's too far. We have to go east of the railway yard instead of west toward our houses like we usually do." Okay. Why did Mick suddenly feel like Devin was hiding something? He opened his mouth to ask what it was, but then he closed his mouth. Maybe a more subtle approach was needed here. Whatever was going on with Devin, Mick thought it would be smarter to watch and wait instead of meeting it head on. Devin finished his crackers, brushed crumbs off his face, and stood. "Come on, I want to scout more locations for Heather." Mick sighed. "Okay." Stuffing empty junk food wrappers into his backpack, Mick said, "But wouldn't you rather play scavenger hunt?" They'd been playing since they were small, and Mick loved it. One of them would pick an object for them to find, and whoever found the closest thing to it would get a junk food reward from the other. That's how they'd gotten most of the treasures they'd lost when their old clubhouse was torn down. A silver ring became a pop-off tab from a soda can. An airplane became a huge plane-shaped tree branch. A pizza became a big flat rock with pepperoni-shaped speckles on it. Devin shrugged. "Okay, we can do that." Mick grinned and scrambled to his feet. "Okay, I'll pick the first object. Let's find a fan." Devin strode ahead. "Sure, why not?" It took nearly an hour to retrace their steps from the falls and get back to a familiar part of the woods. It took that long because Mick was running all over the place looking for something like a fan. When he found a big fern frond, they decided that would do until they located something better. It didn't look like they were going to find something better until a crow pooped on Devin's shoulder. Mick saw it happen. They were strolling along the fern needle-padded forest floor, and Devin was juggling 3 stones as they went. The crow sat on a high branch above their heads. It had cawed when they approached the tree it was in. Mick had looked up at it. As they passed beneath it, the crow flicked its tail feathers and a big white splotch appeared on Devin's shoulder, in sync with a squishy, splatting sound. Mick started to laugh, but then he inhaled sharply, as Devin instantly let loose one of the stones he carried, sending it streaking like a missile toward the crow. The stone hit the crow, with a stomach-churning thwack, and the crow tumbled in what seemed like a slow motion to the ground. It landed a few feet in front of them. While Mick tried to process what had just happened, Devin gestured at the clearly dead bird. "If you want it, a wing would make a better fan," Devin said. Mick stared at the bird. The forest started to spin around him, and he stumbled back, bracing himself against a tree. "You okay?" Devin asked. Mick's mouth was so dry he couldn't speak. Devin started to stroll away, pulling off his shirt as he went. Mick dug out a bottle of water from his backpack and took a big gulp. I don't need a better fan," Mick said when he found his voice, which didn't sound anything like normal. Devin shrugged. "Can I have some of your water to clean my shirt?" Mick handed over his water bottle without speaking. He had no idea what to say. Or maybe he was afraid to say anything at all. On Monday morning, Kelsey was waiting for Mick and Devin at their lockers. Mick was surprised but pleased. Maybe they'd get to hang out at Kelsey's after all. "Hi, Kelsey," he said. "Hey, Mick. Hey, Devin." Mick wasn't sure what to expect from Devin, but he knew Devin was mad at Kelsey. But Devin grinned and smacked Kelsey on the shoulder. Mick noticed Devin had a gauze bandage on his hand, but before he could ask about it, Devin said to Kelsey, "Dude, you have a good weekend?" Mick felt his eyebrows rising. "Huh?" Kelsey's brows went up a notch too. He squinted at Devin for a second. Then he smiled and said, "Look, guys, I'm really sorry about Friday. That was awkward. I wasn't sure what to do. Then when George came back to get you, he said you weren't there. I didn't have your numbers to call you." "Not a problem," Devin said. "It was Ox, and it wasn't your fault." Ox? Mick had never heard Devin say that before. Kelsey blew out air. The tentative smile he'd worn since he approached then morphed into a full grin. "I'm so relieved. I thought you guys would be mad at me. You'd have every right to be." Devin shook his head. "Nah, it's 5 by 5. 5 by 5? Mick felt like he was listening to a defective Devin clone. "Great," Kelsey nodded at several kids who rushed by and waved at him. Then he chuckled and said, "We didn't make much progress on the hangout this weekend. Quincy and Gabriella flaked on me and..." Kelsey looked around. "In all honesty, Heather and her other friends weren't much help." He winked. "But I still don't mind having them around, you know?" Devin gave Kelsey a closed-lipped smile. Then he said, "I know." Was that a muscle twitch at Devin's jawline? Before Mick could answer that question in his head, Devin leaned toward Kelsey. "Listen, I found this place, this abandoned place, just like you were talking about. We could actually use it as a hangout instead of your place. Or we could take some of the seriously cool salvage for your hangout, reclaim materials for super creative spaces." This is better than a sci-fi movie, Mick thought. Make for super creative spaces? He stifled a laugh. Kelsey grinned. "Really? You found an abandoned building? That's cool. I never heard back from my buddy. Are you suggesting we do some urban exploring?" "Exactly," Devin said. "We can meet after school, out back. It's not far. We can walk to it." "Okay." Kelsey gave Devin a fist bump and broke off to go to his first class. Devin glanced at Mick. Apparently seeing something in Mick's face, he said, "What?" Mick shook his head. "Nothing." He still didn't think he should say anything about Devin's strange behavior. Devin wouldn't have been surprised if Kelsey hadn't shown up after school. He thought Kelsey might suspect something, but nope. Apparently he didn't, because he was already waiting behind the school with Mick when Devin let the thick metal door slam behind him. Good. So far, so good. "So where is this place?" Kelsey asked, squinting into the relentlessly bright sun and strolling toward the other boys. "It's kind of in the woods, about a mile east from the railway yard," Devin said, as the boys walked away from the school. "How come we've never heard about it?" Mick asked. "We've both lived here since we were born," he said to Kelsey. Devin shrugged. "Dunno." With Devin in the lead, the boys carefully picked their way through the railway yard, stepping across rails behind a string of lumbering metal freight cars rolling along the tracks. On the far side of the yard, Devin led them into the woods, and they picked up a winding, uneven trail lined with rotting, moss-covered logs and thick clusters of huckleberry bushes and salal shrubs. The air was moist and rich with loamy smell that made Devin think of rainy days. He liked rainy days for the same reason he liked cloudy days. Mick and Kelsey chattered as they walked, mostly about TV shows. Mick was going on about a sci-fi show that followed an apocalyptic society, in which people were killed for even the smallest mistakes. "That sounds interesting," Kelsey said. "Kind of up my alley in an extreme way." "What do you mean?" Mick asked. Kelsey shrugged. "Oh, I just mean I like legal shows, courtroom dramas. I'm going to law school so I can be a real judge someday." A real judge? Devin wondered what that meant. "You don't want to be a builder like your dad?" Devin asked. "No, I like building things, but I'm kind of keen on justice. Dad gets that. He says we all need to do what we're passionate about." That's true, Devin thought. About 100 yards before they reached their destination, the trees thinned, and the sun's rays touched their skin. Devin felt the light and heat hit his face, and for just a second, his feet faltered. "You okay?" Kelsey asked. "Yeah, I just tripped." As fast as it intruded, the sun retreated. Devin turned off the trail and ducked into a denser, darker part of the woods. The other boys followed him. "Are we there yet?" Kelsey asked, then laughed. "My sister always asks that when we're in the car." "Mine too," Mick said. Devin ignored them. They were almost there. He led them around a gnarled space, and there it was. He stopped and waited for Kelsey and Mick to catch up. When they did, he heard them suck in their breath in unison. "Whoa," Kelsey said. "Creeptastic," Mick said. Kelsey laughed. Hunkered in the woods in front of them, a big, low-slung building with a shallow roofline and small boarded-up windows clung, barely, to life. Although the building was intact, it sagged and leaned, like it was getting too tired to stay standing, because a bubble-shaped, filthy but unbroken skylight bulged from the middle of the top of the building. It looked like it wore a bowler hat. It was hard to tell what color the building had been when it was built. Now it was mostly green and black, streaked with mold and mildew and moss. It was also being consumed by wild blackberry bushes. Aggressive, prickly regiments of the vines flanked the building on all sides. The boys could barely see from where they stood. The vines grew low, barely reaching the bottom of the building's few windows. But they were thick, compacted together in a barrier that would demand a blood sacrifice to get past. "You don't expect us to go through those, do you?" Mick asked Devin. Devin laughed. "Do I look stupid?" He laughed harder. "Wait, don't answer." His laughs were high-pitched, kind of girly. Mick was looking at him strangely. "Come on," Devin said, leading the boys around the building. "What was it?" Kelsey asked. Devin gestured at the wall they were passing. An old faded sign hung askew from under the weather-worn eaves. The sign was so faded, you could only make out an F, a Z, and a P. But next to the letters, the image of something round defied the elements. "Is that a pizza?" Mick asked. "I think so," Devin said. "I think this was a pizzeria." "I love pizza," Mick told Kelsey. Kelsey smiled. "Me too. Hey Mick, pull out your cell phone and see if you can find anything out about this place." "I'd do it, but I forgot my phone at home. I realized it after lunch. I don't think I've ever done that before. I feel naked without it." Mick laughed and pulled out his phone. "Don't bother," Devin said. "There's no cell service around this building." Mick held up his phone and turned in a circle. "Well, that's a little spooky-o." "Come on." Devin motioned for the boys to follow him around the opposite side of the building. When his running shoes started making scraping sounds instead of the dull thuds they'd made in the forest, he gestured at the ground. "See? I think this was the parking lot." "Yeah, look." Kelsey pointed to the far side of the lot at a sign tacked to a tree trunk. Probably once white, it was now gray. But when Devin squinted, he could see the letters. "Stomer's on?" "Customers only," Kelsey said. "Should we be here?" Mick asked. Devin glanced at him. "Why not? Does it look like anyone else cares about this place? Besides, no one ever cared that we hung out in the abandoned gas station." "He's got a point," Kelsey said. "Come on over here," Devin said. Although this side of the building looked like it was just as choked by the blackberry bushes as the other side, Devin knew better. He stepped over a chunk of broken concrete and bent over. "Do what I do," he said to the others. Bent almost double, Kevin poked his head into what looked like an impassable blackberry bush. But once you got close, it was clear the bush was growing around something. Devin didn't have any idea what that something was, but it had an opening. He dropped to his knees. "You have to crawl," he called back to the other boys. Mick groaned, but Kelsey shrugged and said, "That's the life of an urban explorer." Devin grinned. Kelsey was wearing jeans with torn knees. Devin was sure they were the kind you bought already torn, the kind that cost $100 at least, more than his mom would ever pay for a pair of jeans. "It'll be worth it, I swear, just go slow," Devin encouraged. He crawled forward. He knew Mick and Kelsey would follow him. They were too curious not to. After about 4 feet of tunneling through a narrow opening, he reached the place where he could stand up. So he did, brushing off his legs as he waited for the others. He looked up and around. He still wasn't sure what this was. It was a rounded enclosure, like some sort of novelty entrance, maybe to the restaurant. He thought part of the entrance collapsed, which was what made that tunnel-like way in and what had protected this part from the weather and the forest's damp air. "This is awesome sauce," Mick said, popping up next to Devin. His breath smelled like his favorite grape soda, and his hair smelled like sweat. Kelsey got to his feet and looked around. Devin noticed one of Kelsey's knees was bleeding. "What is it?" Mick asked. "We used to live by the ocean," Kelsey said, "and there was this gift shop that had a shark's head at the entrance. I think this is like that. Not a shark, obviously, but some kind of animal head. See? There are the eyes." Devin looked up at where Kelsey pointed. He missed that when he was here before. To give himself credit, the first time he was here it was dark. That was Friday evening. He'd wanted to find an abandoned building before Kelsey's buddy from his last town could. So he'd headed out after dinner. His mother had fallen asleep on the sofa, as she always did. He'd gone into the woods to explore. He wasn't sure why he went at night. Maybe he'd hoped he'd get lost. He hadn't really cared. He just wanted to forget what had happened that afternoon. But instead of being lost, he'd found this place. And as he'd explored it, an idea formed. He nurtured that idea all day Saturday and through Sunday morning brunch with his mom. When she fell asleep again, he returned and poked around some more, and his idea grew into a full-fledged plan. The eyes Kelsey pointed out were two round, dirty windows placed where the eyes would be if this was, in fact, a head, and the place where the collapsed area lay was the animal's snout might be. "I think you're right," Mick said. Mick turned around and gestured at the boarded-up door. He said to Devin, "So now what?" On the left side of the door, two boards leaned against the wall. Devin reached out and moved the boards, revealing a sidelight window next to the door. The glass in the sidelight window was broken out. "Did you do that?" Mick asked. "Sure did. Want to take me to jail?" "Ha ha," Mick frowned at it. "You expect me to get through there?" Admittedly, the sidelight was narrow, but Devin had stepped in with no problem, and he figured even Mick could manage it if he sucked in his stomach and they gave him a push. "Yes, I do. That's why I brought this." He pulled from his backpack a roll of duct tape, and while Mick and Kelsey watched, Devin covered the inside of the window frame, which had held the glass, with the thick tape. "This way you won't cut yourself when you squeeze through," he told Mick. Kelsey stared at Devin for a couple of seconds, then said, "Thoughtful." "Yeah, thanks," Mick said. "That's me," Devin thought. Mr. Nice Guy. When he was done taping, he turned sideways and slid through the opening. Once inside, he called, "Even though the skylight is dirty, it lets in enough light to see." "Mostly." "Mick, why don't you go next? I'll pull you if you get stuck, and Kelsey, you push." "Okay," Mick and Kelsey chorused. Mick's soft, round shoulder pushed through the opening. He flailed out a hand, and Devin grabbed it and pulled. "Ow!" Mick protested as he escaped the opening and stumbled to get his balance. Kelsey slithered through behind Mick. "You okay?" Mick rubbed his belly. "Yeah." They all looked around. "Coolfulness," Mick said. They stood in the middle of a huge square room lined with pictures of funky animal characters, alternating with crazy and colorful geometric patterns. A domino-like stack of chairs set against one wall, and another stack of tables lined the other wall. At the other end of the room, a stage, its red velvet and fringed curtains pulled back, presided over the room. And on the stage, Creevy! Mick was rooted to the dirty red linoleum floor. His gaze latched onto the three figures on the stage. "What is that, a chicken?" Kelsey asked, gawking in the same direction. "I think so," Devin said. "Why does it have a cupcake?" Mick asked. "Maybe it's a baking chicken?" Kelsey said, and immediately guffawed. Devin couldn't help himself. He laughed. "Good one." Mick laughed too. "Yeah," his stomach growled. "I wish that was a real cupcake." "Come on," Kelsey walked toward the stage. Good. He was getting into it. Devin smiled. He and Mick followed Kelsey to the stage and looked at the figures closely. The figures seemed to be looking back at them, but of course, that wasn't possible. Devin had to admit he was more comfortable being here today than he had been the day before. Yesterday he'd been spooked. He only came back today because... "They're animatronic," Kelsey said. "Yeah," Devin said. "That's what I thought." "Animatronic? Like robots?" Mick asked. "Sort of," Kelsey said. "Animatronics can be powered in different ways. Sometimes they use pneumatics or hydraulics, sometimes electricity, sometimes they're computer-driven." "How do you know all that?" Devin asked in spite of himself. "Dad worked on an amusement park resort project once. They had animatronic birds." "Why a chicken, a rabbit, and a bear?" Mick asked. "A chicken, a rabbit, and a bear walked into a pizza joint," Kelsey said, and the three boys laughed. Kelsey was a funny dude, Devin had to admit. Too bad he had to go and... Mick gasped. Is that a hook? To the left of the stage, a cave-like protrusion, shrouded in a black, heavy curtain, announced itself to be Pirate's Cove. Devin hadn't looked behind that curtain. Something about that hook. Come on, he said. There's more to see. Like a short, musicless conga line led by Devin's flashlight, the boys did a tour of the dirty pizza place. When Devin had first explored the pizzeria, he felt like he'd drop into some kind of time warp. Although the interior of the building was damp and there was mildew in places on the ceiling and walls, it didn't have the trashed look you'd expect in an abandoned building. It seemed like the restaurant had been closed and no one had been inside of it since. They found the kitchen stripped of its appliances and other equipment. But oddly, it had several jugs of distilled water lined up on the floor of one of the walls. A small office with an old scratched metal desk also had a filing cabinet that was intriguingly locked. If Devin didn't have other plans, he'd want to break it open. Kelsey suggested it, but Devin said they'd get to that later. He led the other boys to a room with banks of control panels and ancient, chunky computer screens, and then they visited a couple of disgusting bathrooms with broken tile, cracked sinks, and exposed pipes. While they were in the bathroom, Devin was pretty sure he heard something slithering through the walls. He didn't say anything. From the way the other boys' faces paled, he knew they heard it too. They didn't mention it either, but they all quickly crowded through the bathroom door and ended up back in the narrow hall. The best part is down here, Devin said, mentioning the others to follow him. Devin's heart rate picked up speed. He could almost hear his adrenaline revving at the starting line. He suppressed a smile. Why did he think that? He wasn't into cars. 6.2-liter V8, he sing-songed in his head. Storage? Mick asked. This is what you want us to see? Devin grinned. Yeah, come on. He pushed the door to the storage room open, shined his flashlight into the room, and stepped back so they could see. It was like looking into some deranged person's closet. Headless animals hung on long rods that lined the two walls of the room. Well, okay, not actually headless animals, but headless animal suits. The suits were dingy and dusty. Some were dark with mildew. They all looked stiff and ragged and ratty with fur missing in places. On the opposite wall, 3 rows of shelves held animal heads. Bears and rabbits and birds and dogs. Every head looked a little battered, like it had been used as a bowling ball or something. But the eyes were in place of all of them. They all stared straight ahead, like they were lined up for roll call. Screepy, Mick said. Devin looked at Kelsey. Kelsey's eyes were bright. He started poking around in the cabinets that lined the walls on either side of the door. Look at all this stuff, he said. He pointed at bins of nails, screws, brackets, wires, and what looked like metal joints. He whirled and grinned at Devin. You're a genius, Devin. I think I can salvage one of those suits and maybe build our own animatronic character for my hangout. Devin couldn't help but notice the use of the word my. Last week, Kelsey had said our. A sound similar to rushing water filled his ears. He was pretty sure it was blood racing through his veins in excitement. Look over here, he gestured for Kelsey to follow him, and went to the back of the room, to a small corner closet. His feet made raspy scuffs along the floor that sounded bizarrely menacing. Devin had found the closet when he was here for the first time. Partially hidden behind costumes hung on the inner wall of the room, he'd seen the potential in it, and that had given him his idea. However, it was his second visit that locked it down, so to speak. Kelsey glanced at Devin, then grasped the closet's metal handle. Stepping back into the side, he slowly pulled the door open a few inches. Satisfied nothing was going to jump out at him, he opened the door the rest of the way. Devin's flashlight beam reflected off the pair of big, round eyes. Mick crowded in behind them. What's that? Kelsey reached for the arm of the human-sized yellow bear standing in front of them. Devin knew what he'd discover. The arm was heavy. This wasn't just a furry suit like the ones hanging on the rods. It's an animatronic suit, Kelsey said. It has animatronic, abilities, I guess, but it can be worn like a costume. I've read about some cutting-edge stuff they're doing with these, where you get in and the suit reads your vital signs and responds to your pulse and temperature and stuff. Some can even respond to specific commands. Let the wearer speak in the voice of the character. I'm sure that's not what this is, though. It's too old. I wonder how it works. He pulled on the arm again. Let's get it out in the open. I think it'll take all 3 of us. Sure, Devin said. We can do it. This was going even better than he imagined. He thought he was going to have to talk Kelsey into this, but it looked like he was going to do it all on his own. It was like it was meant to be. The 3 boys grunted with effort. Mick sneezing a few times when tufts and tufts of the bear fur came loose. Working together, they managed to get the bear suit out of the closet and over to the middle of the storage room floor. They lay the bear on its back, panting to catch their breath. They gazed at the strange character whose sightless eyes looked straight up at the ceiling in the model of Devon's flashlight and the room's dark shadows. "Let's drag it all out to the main room so we can see it better," Devon suggested. "Yeah," Kelsey said. More grunting and sneezing got the yellow bear suit into the main part of the pizzeria. Once they had it in the middle of the floor, Devon knew it was time. "Mick, why don't you go back and find lids of those bins of screws and stuff? You can stack them and bring them out. We can take it with us for Kelsey's hangout." Mick looked over his shoulder at the gloomy hallway. "Take my flashlight," Devon said. Mick looked back at the bear. Devon could see Mick shudder. "Okay," he agreed. As soon as Mick left the room, Devon said to Kelsey, "That bear looks like you." "Huh?" "Well, not as cool, but his hair's sort of the same color. And he's smiling like you usually do. If you got this suit working, it could be like the mascot of your hangout." Kelsey grinned. "That's not bad." He leaned over and took the bear's head in his hands. "Does this come off?" He tugged, and the bear's head released from the suit. He looked into the top of the torso and sniffed. "Doesn't smell too bad. No worse than the rest of the building." "Nope, I noticed that too." He nudged Kelsey and grinned. "Try it on." Kelsey studied the suit's neck opening, then shrugged. "Why not?" He sat down and started wiggling into the torso. Once in, he said, "This is pretty comfortable." He grinned. Now the head. Devon had just clipped on the head when Mick shuffled into the room, dragging a sack of plastic bins. "No lids. I'm not sure how we're going to be able to take this stuff out." He stopped and stared at the bear on the floor. He looked around. "Where's Kelsey?" "I'm in here," Kelsey called out. Mick's eyes widened. "What are—" Kelsey sat up and said, "I'm not sure how to stand in this thing, but hey, I could whack." He began throwing his arms around in elaborate dance moves. When he threw both arms straight out to his sides, an ear-stabbing, metallic clap resounded off all four walls around them. The clap was followed by a fingernails on a blackboard scraping sound. As abruptly as it started, the scraping sound ended with a loud slap. This triggered a cascade of snapping sounds, like dozens of steel animal traps springing into place, one right after the other. Kelsey started shrieking with the first snap. Once, when Devon was little, his mom was driving him to school, and she ran over a cat in the street. The cat didn't die immediately. Instead, it made a sound that was like all the sounds of suffering rolled into one. Screaming, wailing, howling, and other vocals Devon couldn't even describe. That sonic signature was embedded in Devon's brain. He'd always thought it would be the worst thing he'd ever hear in his life. He was wrong. This was the worst. And the sound wasn't the bad part. It was bad, yes, but the bad part, the really, really bad part, was the way the suit started jerking in a spastic, horrific dance. It looked like the moth-eaten, mildew-blotched gold bear was convulsing. But it wasn't the bear. Devon knew it wasn't the bear. It was Kelsey. What did I do? Devon thought. "What's wrong with him?" Mick yelled. Devon jumped. He'd been so mesmerized by Kelsey's suffering, he'd forgotten Mick was there. Kelsey's shrieks stopped, like someone or something had severed his vocal cords, and the suit went still. That's when Devon noticed it was turning red. Deep, dark, wet red. "Is that—" Mick pointed. He dropped to his knees. "That's blood." Yeah, that was blood. Devon sat back on the floor and pulled his feet tight to his body. The blood saturated the bear's matted fur in seconds and began pooling on the floor, because the linoleum was blood red. Kelsey's blood blended with the floor. The only reason Devon could see it was that Kelsey's blood was moving. It had formed an amoeba-like puddle that seemed to be crawling away from the now saturated bear suit. Devon stared at the moving blood. It looked like it was a living thing. A thinking, red liquid lake, stretching out, seeking. Devon scooted even farther away. He groaned and dropped his head into his hands. This isn't what he meant to do. He'd planned to trap Kelsey in the bear suit and leave him like that for an hour or so to freak him out, as payback for what happened. If he'd thought for a minute that this is what would... He was angry, yes, jealous. Since Friday afternoon, maybe even before, he'd hated Kelsey more than he'd hated anyone or anything. He'd even hated Kelsey more than he hated his missing dad. He'd hated Kelsey because Kelsey had everything Devin wanted, just when it was looking like he had a chance with Heather. Okay, maybe he'd been deluding himself about that, but still, he wasn't even given the opportunity to find out. Kelsey swept in and made friends with everyone in like 2 seconds. Devin had been trying for his whole life to make one friend other than Mick. Kelsey had no right to have everything come so easily to him. But that didn't mean he deserved this. Devin brushed the tears he didn't realize had formed in his eyes. Dev. He wiped his face and looked at Mick. Mick was sitting on the floor on the opposite side of the bleeding bear suit. Yeah, sure. Bleeding bear suit. Devin was still deluding himself. The bear suit wasn't bleeding. Kelsey was. Devin heard Mick hiccup, and he realized Mick was crying. His dirty face was streaked with tears, giving him a strangely tribal look, like he had vertical stripes of war paint on his cheeks. Poor kid, Devin thought. Mick wasn't mature enough to handle something like this. And Devin was? He barked a laugh. Mick's gaze, which had been riveted on the bear suit and the flowing blood, whipped to Devin. Why are you laughing? His voice was pitched high. Devin shook his head. It's never mind. I think maybe it's shock. Mick stared at him for a few seconds, then shifted his attention back to the suit. He flinched. Look at it. It's still moving. He's alive. We have to get him out of there. Devin glanced at the suit. It kind of pulsed, like it was a large, bloody heart getting in its last beats. Mick repeated, We have to get him out of there. We can't, Devin said. What do you mean? Mick, his mouth hanging open, tears still leaking, his nose running, continued to watch the occasionally trembling suit. For how long? Devin wasn't sure. He didn't feel like he was really there anymore. Obviously he was, but he wasn't. He was back in his past. He was watching his dad drive away the day he left and never came back. He was watching his tired mother make yet another meal of boxed macaroni and cheese. He was in school watching all the other kids laugh and joke with one another. He was hanging out with Mick in their gas station clubhouse. He was watching Heather, wishing she would notice him. He was relishing the moment she said his name. He was listening to her talk about justice in social studies class. He could see her in her red sweater, and he could hear her tinkling voice. I think justice is payback. Payback. That was all he'd intended to do. He'd wanted justice. Payback. Kelsey had hurt him. He'd made Devin feel like he might be a part of something, and then he'd throw Devin away. It stung, like being stabbed with a sharp object. He just wanted Kelsey to feel something similar, and maybe he'd want Kelsey to end up scarred, like Devin was scarred by every rejection he'd endured. But he hadn't wanted this. Not this. Accidents happen, Heather trilled in his mind. Devin yelped when Mick took his shoulder. How did Mick get over here? Devin frowned and shook his cobweb-filled head. Why aren't you answering me? I keep asking what you mean. What do you mean we can't get him out? Mick was close. Too close. Devin could see snot drying under Mick's nose. I mean, we can't because... Devin moaned. Mick studied him for several seconds, and then slowly scooted away from Devin. Did you do this on purpose? Devin didn't answer him. Did you? Devin tried to moisten his mouth enough to swallow. Did you murder him? Mick screamed. No! Devin shot up off the floor and started pacing back and forth. Suddenly, tears poured from his eyes and he couldn't stop them. No! But what just happened? Mick hugged his knees and rocked himself. Devin stared at the bloody suit. He rubbed his face. I wanted to get back at him. By killing him? Mick scrambled to his feet. No! Then what? When I was here before, I found the suit and I tried to put the arm on. His words distorted his sobs. He knew. He could see Mick concentrating, trying to understand him. The suit has these locking things inside. Once you snap it in place, it's almost impossible to get it off by yourself. Devin tapped the gauze on the back of his arm, where he'd torn off some skin escaping the suit's heavy arm. So you knew what would happen? No, I mean, yes, but no. I mean, I only wanted to scare him. I figured once he was locked in, we'd leave him in this place until sundown, just to make him sweat a bit. I wanted to make him feel something unfair, like what he did to us. Like what I felt when he and his neighbor drove away with... I wanted him to be hurt. I didn't want him to actually get hurt, though. Not like that. The golden suit shuddered, and Kelsey let out a gurgle. He's still alive, Mick whispered. He started toward the suit, but Devin grabbed his arm. Don't touch it! Mick broke free, stared at Devin for a second, then he ran toward the building entrance. We have to get help! Devin ran after him and grabbed his arm again. We can't do that! What? Why? We'll go to jail. You'll go to jail. You want me to go to jail? No, of course not. Haven't we always been in this together? Well, yeah. We're in this together too. Devin turned around and looked at Kelsey and the blood on the floor. The red rivulets weren't spreading as quickly, but they were still moving, crawling like an army of red soldiers across the linoleum. We can't possibly get him help fast enough. He's lost too much blood. If we try, we'll only get ourselves in trouble. Mick stared even harder at Devin. Are you even sorry this happened? Of course I am, Devin yelled. Mick held up his hands. Okay. He took a ragged breath. Okay. Devin realized he was shaking. He felt tremors in both of his legs. He had to concentrate to stay standing. He was a murderer. A chill skittered along his neck. He wasn't sure whether what he was feeling was because of what he'd done, or because he was afraid he was going to get in trouble for what he'd done. He took a deep breath and squared his shoulders. Okay. This is what we're going to do. Mick rubbed his nose and looked at Devin as if Devin was going to make everything better. Devin would never be able to make everything better. We can't undo what happened, he said. We? Mick objected. You make it sound like I was a part of this. I wasn't part of it. Okay, me. I can't undo it. So from here, we have a choice. Either we tell and I go to jail, or we don't tell and I don't go to jail. Either way, Kelsey is the same. I wish I hadn't done it. I'm sorry. Very, very sorry, but that doesn't help Kelsey. Me going to jail doesn't help him either. You're saying we should leave him? Mick's voice was hushed. Devin took a deep breath and let it out. Yes, that's what I'm saying. For at least a minute, the boys stood there. Outside, a crow cawed. Another answered. Inside, the only sounds were those of Devin's and Mick's open-mouthed breathing. Both were stuffed up from crying. The uneven and quick huffing sounds they were making were eerie, but not as eerie as that dry, scuttling sound. What was that? Devin grabbed Mick's arm. Come on. Where did you leave your backpack? Mick pointed. It was against the wall near the entrance, right next to Devin's backpack. Devin made himself turn around and look for his flashlight. It was lying next to the stack of bins Mick had dragged out of the storage room. Making a wide arc, well away from the bear suit and the blood, Devin strode across the room and got his flashlight. Did you leave anything else? He tried to ignore the fact that the scuttling sound was coming from the bear suit. Mick, whose eyes looked glazed, blinked and looked around. I don't think so. Devin willed his legs to function right. He still felt like he was shaking all over, and he was still having trouble breathing. But he had to get them out of here. Shoving his flashlight into his backpack, he grabbed Mick by the arm. Come on. Devin willed his legs to function right. He still felt like he was shaking all over, and he was still having trouble breathing. But he had to get them out of here. Shoving his flashlight in his backpack, he grabbed Mick by the arm. Come on. Devin slipped through the sidelight and yanked Mick through behind him. Mick grunted, but he didn't complain. Once they'd crawled out into the late afternoon sunshine, though, Mick spoke up. What about Kelsey's backpack? Devin looked back at the building. Should he go get it? And do what with it? No. No one was going to come out here. And if they did and they went in, they'd find Kelsey, wouldn't they? So what did it matter if his backpack was there too? Devin looked at Mick, who was looking around at the woods as if he was trying to figure out what they were. Devin grabbed his arm. Come on. Devin was afraid to go to sleep that night. He thought he'd have nightmares. He was so tired at the end of the day that sleep was like a black void. And the black void was his friend. Not only was it like a blanket of blissful nothingness that wiped out the events of the day, it had a lingering effect the next morning. It acted sort of like one of sheer curtains his mom had hung in their kitchen. You could still see through it, but it obscured the details. Tuesday morning, Devin knew what he had done the day before. He remembered everything, but it was just murky enough to feel unreal, as if he'd watched it on a scary movie instead of living it. Before he and Mick had to split up to head home the previous afternoon, Devin had said to Mick, "In it together." Mick had repeated the words flatly, like a robot running low on power. That had worried Devin before he went to bed last night. This morning he wasn't concerned. Mick would be quiet. And Mick was, in fact, quiet. Too quiet. One of the things that Devin had been able to count on for the previous 10 years was that his high school days would start with Mick chattering. Today, though, Mick wasn't chattering. The boys were now settling in against a stone wall where they linked to eat lunch outside, and Mick hadn't said more than, "Hey, Dev," when Devin had met up with him to walk to school. Devin was still in a twilight state of denial, but the twilight was wearing off. When Mrs. Patterson had noted Kelsey's absence from class, the filmy barrier between Devin and what he'd done tore a little bit. The details were coming back. Mick opened his lunch sack with none of his usual enthusiasm. Devin tried to animate his friend. "What did you get today?" Mick's mom always put in at least one treat in Mick's lunch. "Huh?" Mick sniffed. "Oh, I don't know." Devin sighed. Mick set down his sack and leaned toward Devin. He whispered, "I can't stop thinking about him." "Shh," Devin hissed. "Not here." Mick's eyes moistened, and his face turned red. Devin glanced around and then patted Mick's hand. "It's okay. We'll talk about it this afternoon, okay? We'll go to our camp." He'd hoped the words "our camp" would soothe Mick. Mick liked it when Devin called their makeshift, tarp-covered temporary meeting place our camp. Mick wiped his eyes. "Okay." But he said it so quietly, Devin could barely hear him. Settled cross-legged on the cool but dry forest floor, Mick played with a pile of tiny fir cones. Devin watched him, waiting for his friend to speak. He waited for several minutes. Finally, Mick said, "What if he's still alive?" He glanced up from his fir cone art and then looked back down. "That's what I can't stop thinking about. What if he's still alive?" Devin didn't respond. He thought about that too, but he was sure trying not to. "I almost puked when they called his name in class," Mick said. Devin couldn't relate, but he didn't say so. Instead, he said, "I don't think he's still alive." Mick raised his head and blinked at Devin. "But you're not sure." Devin shook his head. He could almost hear the ripping sound as a flimsy barrier protecting him from the previous day tore open a little more. He screwed his eyes shut, as if that would help. "No, I'm not sure." Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. By Wednesday, panicked fear and mystery rippled through the school like concussive waves radiating onward from a Ground Zero event. It was all anyone was talking about. Where was Kelsey? The police had been called in. Mick stayed home from school sick for all 3 days. When Devin went to see him, Mick swore he wouldn't say anything to anyone, but Mick couldn't keep any food down. His mother thought he had a stomach flu. Devin handled the whole thing better than Mick. His years living on the outside of the social groups of the school had given him the ability to keep his face neutral, no matter how he felt on the inside. He was able to go about his business nearly invisibly. He was sure he looked normal, even though he was anything but. Every muscle in his body felt rigid. It hurt to move, but he couldn't be still, either. By the end of the week, Devin had nearly chewed his nails off. On Friday afternoon, Mr. Wright announced to the school that the police concluded Kelsey had run away. Apparently, no one had seen Kelsey leave the school with Devin and Mick, and apparently, Kelsey hadn't told anyone where he was going. Neither one of these things surprised Devin. As far as he knew, only he and Mick left school the way they did. They were the only ones who cut through the railway yard, and of course, Kelsey wouldn't tell anyone he was going someplace with Mick and Devon. You only had to be in the school a couple of days to know that it was social suicide to hang out with Mick and Devon. Kelsey was smart enough to have figured that out. Devon was still surprised Kelsey had even apologized to them on Monday. He thought it would be much harder than it was to lure Kelsey to... Accidents happen. Devon visited Mick on Friday afternoon. Mick was eating a bowl of soup when Devon arrived. "He's keeping his food down," Mick's mom said, giving Devon a hug in the doorway of Mick's room. "I doubt he's contagious or anything. Go on in." "Thanks, Mrs. Callahan." Devon smiled at the round, red-headed, freckled woman. He felt like he had bugs crawling up his arms. It was her hug. He'd felt the same every time his mom had hugged him during the week. He didn't deserve hugs. "Do you want any soup, dear?" Mrs. Callahan asked. "There's plenty." Devon shook his head. No thank you." Mrs. Callahan chucked him under the chin. "You boys are growing up so fast." She bustled away. Devon plopped down on the red beanbag chair just inside the door of Mick and Debbie's room. "Hey," he said to Mick. He glanced at the bright blue and yellow polka dot divider curtains. Mick, tucked under a red superhero blanket on his bed, propped up with pillows and matching cases, wiped his mouth. "Hey." He looked like he was going to say something else, but then he went back to eating his soup from a huge orange bowl. Devon looked around the tiny half room. Unlike Devon's room, which was pretty bare except for a few nature posters and a couple rock collections, Mick's room was packed full of toys. It didn't look like a 15-year-old's room. It looked like a kid's room. Mick's part of the room didn't have much furniture, just a bed, a nightstand, and some shelves with a drop-down desk built in. The shelves held books, but they were also crowded with superhero and sci-fi action figures and stacks of board games. Devon looked over at the curtain again. Mick must have noticed. "Debbie's staying over at a friend's house." Devon nodded. Mick dropped his spoon. It hit the bowl with a clatter. He wiped his mouth and then said through the napkin he held against his face, "What if he's still alive?" Devon whipped around to be sure the door was still closed. "She's in the kitchen," Mick said. "Dad's not home." He shoved his tray away. "I haven't told anyone and I'm not going to, but I can't stop thinking about him. What if he's alive?" "It's been 6 days. Yeah, but he's not alive. But he could be. How? He can't move and he doesn't have water." "How long can people go without water?" Mick asked. Before Devon could even try to answer, Mick said, "Wait, there was water in the kitchen." David tensed. Mick was right. "What if Kelsey managed to get that?" Mick asked. "How? That suit was really heavy and he lost a lot of blood." Understatement of the year. Mick twisted his mouth and thought about that. True. But what if the suit worked with him? Like he said, some suits that can. What if it helped him get to the kitchen? Devon thought that sounded pretty out there, but what part of what had happened wasn't out there? If that happened, he could still be alive, and we can't leave him there like that. Mick leaned forward. "I'll be quiet, I swear, but first we have to go back and make sure he's well, or not. If he's alive, we have to help him. We just do. That's all." Mick wasn't going to let this go. "Okay," Devon said, "but we're not going. I'll go." "But no way is your mom going to let you go into the woods. She thinks you've had the flu, and if you're right, we can't wait any longer. I'll go." "What if he's alive? How will you get him to a hospital?" "I'll call someone after I check on him." Remembering the building's cell phone dead zone, he said, I'll take bandages and stuff with me so I can, what do they call it, stabilize? So I can stabilize him. What I can do is stay there with him and take care of him until he's better. I can take food and stuff, and when he's better, I'll leave and go to the cell phone range to call for help. That will give me time, too, to convince him not to tell anyone anything." Mick rubbed his nose and thought this over. Finally, he said, "That's a good idea." Devon looked at his innocent friend. Mick had no clue. Devon struggled out of the beanbag chair and went to Mick's bed. He put a hand on Mick's shoulder. "You have to make me a promise." "What?" "I don't know how long it's going to take me to get Kelsey out of the suit and help him get well. You have to cover for me." Mick nodded. "How?" "I'm going to tell my mom I'm spending a few days here because you need the company since Debbie is gone. She'll go for that." "Okay. And if I'm not back by Monday, you have to tell the teachers I'm homesick. Got it?" "Sure, I can do that." "And for as long as it takes, keep telling them I'm sick. Are you sure you can do that?" Mick nodded. "No matter what, you can't tell anyone where I am." "Okay, I'll in it together swear if you want." Devin shrugged. Sure. He held out his index finger and listened to Mick's in it together swear that he'd cover Devin's tracks for as long as he needed. You're a good friend, Devin said. Mick grinned. When he got home from visiting Mick, Devin told his mom he was going back. Oh, that's nice of you, kiddo, she said. She looked relieved. Devin figured she was thinking about going to bed early. Devin went into his sparse room. He looked around. He still wasn't sure what he was going to do when he got back to the pizzeria, but if he was going back, he needed tools. He sat down on the edge of his twin bed. It sagged under his weight, and he heard one of the box springs groan. What if he didn't go back at all, and just told Mick he'd gone back and found Kelsey dead? No, he couldn't do it. Even though he'd slept well Monday night, every night since then he'd had nightmares. In every nightmare, Kelsey was a zombie, stalking Devin no matter where he went. No, he had to go back and be sure. He picked up his backpack. He pulled his books and phone out of it. He glanced at the phone and sighed. Great. It was dead. Oh well. He put it on the charger. He wouldn't be able to use it near the building anyway. He looked around again. His gaze landed on the hammer lying on the floor of his open closet. He'd taken it from his mom's meager supply of tools to fix a shelf a couple of weeks before, and he'd never put it away. That would do to open the suit, if it came to that. The sun was starting to sink into the horizon by the time Devin reached the blackberry-choked building. Before he ducked under the collapsed animal head opening, he got out his flashlight and the hammer. As he had since he'd entered the forest, he did his best to ignore the rustling, cheering, and crackling he heard in the woods. Just little forest animals, he kept telling himself, as he nervously ate the chocolate candy bar that would serve as his dinner. And what would be waiting inside the building? Taking a deep breath, Devin crawled into the building's outer entrance and then hesitated only a few seconds before slipping in through the side light. Once there, though, he froze, shining his flashlight around in jerky spasms. He half expected Kelsey in the bloody bear suit to loom up in front of him and attack. He was poised to escape back through the side light, but nothing came at him. He was alone. Well, except for Kelsey's body in the bear suit and the animatronic characters on the stage. Devin took a tentative step and paused. He listened. The building was totally silent. It felt sinister. Devin had the urge to run, even though nothing was moving. Nothing was chasing him. He quelled his fears and moved forward. Bypassing the blood-soaked bear suit in the middle of the floor, Devin did a tour of the entire building. He went into every room and shined a light into every nook and cranny. He'd watched enough TV to know you cleared the building before you let down your guard. Everything was exactly as they'd left it when they were here on Monday, except for the smell. The earthy, metallic odor of blood had hit Devin as soon as he'd stepped into the building. Another smell warred with the smell of blood, too. It was sickly sweet, a nauseating smell. Devin was pretty sure it was the smell of decay, but he wasn't sure. Okay, he'd put it off as long as he could. With slow, shuffling steps, Devin approached the bear suit. He stopped when he reached the outer edge of the blood pool. It was easy to spot. The blood had blackened as it dried. It was now darker than the floor, and its outline stood out starkly in the glow of Devin's flashlight. Gritting his teeth, Devin bent over and touched the edge of the blood. He yanked his hand back. It was a little sticky. Okay. That was okay. He was prepared for this. He didn't know how long it took blood to completely dry, but he figured the damp atmosphere of the building would slow down the process. Devin took off his backpack, and he pulled out the plastic tarp he'd folded and stuffed into it. Instead of bringing food and bandages he'd promised Mick he'd bring, he'd brought the tarp. He knew Kelsey couldn't be alive, and he didn't want to have to sit in blood to check Kelsey's. Devin made himself stop thinking. He set his backpack against the wall and spread the tarp over the blood near the head of the suit. He had to breathe through his nose because here the blood and decay smells were stronger. Kelsey had to be dead. Devin wouldn't be able to sleep, though, unless he knew for sure. He trained his light on the bear's head. His His muscles stiffened because he expected to see Kelsey's eyes staring back at him through the eye holes in the bear's head. But nothing. The eye holes were empty. Dark. Devin leaned closer, aiming the light down into the holes. Why couldn't he see Kelsey's face? He checked over his shoulder to be sure he was still alone. Had the characters on the stage moved? He sucked in his breath and ran his flashlight's beam over them. He frowned. He couldn't remember how they'd been positioned before. He watched for several more seconds before turning the flashlight back to his task. He put his face closer to the bear's face. He still couldn't see anything. He'd have to take off the head. That meant touching the bloody fur. Good thing he prepared for that too. Devin dug into his pants pocket and pulled out a pair of his mother's rubber cleaning gloves. He put them on, propping the flashlight on the bear's chest to aim it at the neck and hesitating for a second to be sure the chest wasn't moving. Devin felt for the lock mechanism that held the head in place. It took him only seconds to find it, but it wouldn't release. He pushed, he pulled, he pinched. He finally pounded on it with his hammer, but the head would not let go of the torso. Fine. Devin inserted the claw part of the hammer into the bear's mouth. Using his other hand for leverage, he pried the mouth open. He sucked in his breath at the ratcheting sound the mouth made when it yawned open. It sounded like teeth gnashing together, which made no sense. It was opening, not closing. Letting out his breath, Devin lit up the mouth opening with a flashlight. He tilted his head and looked as far inside the head as he could. Nothing was inside of it. Really? Devin shone the flashlight into the head some more. For sure, empty. Had the bear cut off Kelsey? Had the bear suit cut off Kelsey's head? Had the bear suit cut off Kelsey's head? Yeah, and done what with it? Ate it? Goosebumps sprang up on Devin's arm because he was reminded of his bounce house story. If a bounce house could eat a toddler, a bear costume could eat a teenager, right? Get a grip, he muttered. Somewhere in the building, something sputtered faintly. Devin whipped his head around and aimed his flashlight all around the room. It had sounded sort of like a fizzle, like a hoarse exhale. Had it come from behind him? Or in front of him? He rotated back quickly so he could inspect the bear suit again. Its bloody fur gleamed in the light, but it wasn't moving. Get on with it, David commanded himself. He bent over and directed his light into the bear's mouth again. This time, he concentrated on trying to see down into the torso. At first, he didn't see anything, but then he thought he saw something farther down. Had Kelsey somehow slid into the suit? Was that his hair Devin could see? He turned the light this way and that, but he couldn't see any better. He'd have to feel. Happy for the gloves he wore, Devin squared his shoulders and took a deep breath. He then slid his arm through the bear's mouth, down inside the bear suit, until all but the uppermost part of his arm was inside. He felt around with his hand, and he still didn't feel anything. But he heard something. Someone or something called his name. Devin! Devin jerked and started to yank his arm from the suit, but the mouth clamped down on his arm and locked shut with a simultaneous clank and crack. The crack was the bone in Devin's arm. Devin screamed at the searing pain that shot from his bicep all the way down to the tip of his fingers. Tears sprang into his eyes. He waited in agony and fear. He also tried to pull his arm out of the bear suit. Bad idea. He howled and held very still. Sweat joined the tears running down his face. Moving his arm was pure torture. It felt like the bear was trying to rip his arm off his body. Nausea crawled up from his stomach and choked him. He gagged and turned his head to vomit all over his lap. The acidic smell and putrid brown chunky spew made him gag again, and he let loose with another torrent of puke. Bawling now, Devin yelled for help, even though he knew help wasn't going to come. Help! The sound he made was even worse than the sound Kelsey had made when the suit had impaled him. It was definitely worse of the dying cat. It was the sound of anguish and despair. It was the sound of hopelessness. Spittle dribbled from his mouth as his cry dissolved into a sob. Ignoring the torment of the lava-hot pain in his right arm, Devin used his left hand to pound ineffectually at the bear's mouth. He kept hitting his arm with the hammerhead, and he shrieked every time he did. Still, he kept trying to pound the mouth open. When he finally lost the strength to hold the hammer, it bounced off the bear's torso and hit the bloody floor with a thunk. He started thinking to drag the bear suit across the floor. He was out of his head, not thinking logically. He knew he couldn't move the suit. Collapsing in his own disgusting stink, Devin curled onto his side, whimpering at every fresh wave of pain that tore through his arm. He tried to ignore the faint sensation of wet warmth trickling down his bicep. Calm down, he told himself. Mick knew where he was. Mick would come for him. Devin moaned. No, he wouldn't. Mick would do what Devin told him to do. How long did it take to bleed to death? Not long if he was bleeding a lot, he didn't think, but it didn't feel like he was bleeding much. The trickle of warmth stopped at his elbow joint, and it wasn't moving anymore. No, he wasn't going to bleed to death. So how long before he died for lack of water? That was what was going to happen. He hadn't brought water because he hadn't planned on helping Kelsey. So now he couldn't help himself. Inside the suit, he flexed his fingers. He moaned when the movement sent another volley of pain up his arm. Then he froze, sucked in his breath, and clenched his fingers into a fist. Had he just felt something move inside the suit? No, not. Another slight brush of something moving grazed his knuckles. Bugs, Devin whispered. He watched enough TV to know that bugs like dead bodies. It was bugs, right? No, it couldn't be. Kelsey? Devin thrashed his entire body, writhing violently in a crazed panic. He threw his whole body into it, screaming through the pain the flailing caused in his arm. Vomit sprayed, and the plastic tarp crackled around him. He didn't stop. He fought to free himself with every bit of strength he had. But it wasn't enough. In fact, it was making things worse. After one of his bucking movements, Devin felt his arm loosen for just an instant. But the second it did, it didn't start to come out. It went farther in. With dread, Devin looked at the suit and realized the mouth had opened farther. The suit was clamped around his shoulder instead of his bicep. Now he knew. He was going to die here. He couldn't get his arm free, and he couldn't move the suit, and Mick was going to be sure no one came for him. Mick had disagreed with Devin plenty of times over the years, but he never went against Devin. Not one single time. Devin thought about the movie he saw where the man sawed his arm off to free himself when he got his arm caught under a boulder. He gagged and retched. Not a good thought, and not helpful either. Even if he had a knife or a saw, he didn't think he could do that. Devin wiggled in one more attempt to free himself. The mouth opened even more, and Devin got a sudden glimpse inside the suit. He gasped, and for a moment, shock blocked his pain. Down low, past his arm, Devin could see a body. A dead body, just like he thought he'd find when he came back here to check. But it wasn't exactly what he thought he'd find. The body he thought he'd find didn't have blonde hair. This one had curly black hair. The body in the suit wasn't Kelsey. Devin only had a second to try to make sense of this before his shoulder was sucked into the suit. Devin screamed, but no one heard him. On Monday morning, Mick was disappointed when Devin didn't meet Mick to walk to school. Mick hoped he'd find Devin waiting for him at the lockers, waiting to tell him Kelsey was going to be okay, or even waiting to tell him Kelsey was dead. That wasn't as good, but it would be better than the way things left last week. Not knowing whether Kelsey was dead was like being eaten alive, like getting digested by that creep-style bounce house in the story Devin read in English class a couple weeks ago. Was that just a couple weeks ago? Speaking of English class, Mick was supposed to read a poem out loud today. Remembering that made his stomach churn. It twisted up his insides so much he didn't worry too much about Devin not being in school. Devin had told him it might take a while to get Kelsey well enough to move him. Something about that seemed. Someone bumped into Mick, and he dropped his backpack. He bent over, picked it up, and went to class. In English class, Mick was reading his poem over and over while Mrs. Patterson did roll call. He was so into it, he jumped when Mrs. Patterson called out, "Mick? Here? Yes, I know you're here. I asked you if you know where your budding horror writer is." "Huh? Devin. Where's Devin?" "Oh, sorry, he's homesick." "Okay." Mick smiled. He'd done his part. In it together for as long as it takes. Kelsey leaned against a column in the rotunda of his new school. He watched the other kids, and he smiled or nodded at everyone who passed him, saying hey when someone said hello. His gaze kept returning to a couple of boys who lingered outside the front doors of the school. One of the boys wore all black. The other wore ragged jeans and a faded t-shirt. Other kids coming into the school ignored the boys, or gave them scathing looks, but both boys occasionally snickered at passing kids. Kelsey pushed off the column and strolled toward the boys as they finally sauntered into the school. He stopped in front of them and said, "Hey, I'm Kelsey. I'm new here." Both boys eyed him, brows raised. He gave them each a big, friendly grin. "So," Kelsey said, "any cool places to hang out around here?"